I know there's a lot of unrest and people being killed, so that's about it.
I just know there's warring factions over there, and it's trying to work out who's really running the country at the moment, and no one seems to know.
And the war in Syria at the moment is a bit of an uprising from within Syria to demonstrate their lack of satisfaction with their government.
What I understand about Syria at the moment is that it is as close to a civil war as what you can get in a country.
Yeah, Syria's had a dictatorship for, I don't know, just about forever, I imagine.
Basically a civil war. It sort of came from the Arab Spring uprising, and unlike some of the other countries, hasn't resolved. I think it's appalling that there's no intervention.
I think NATO bombing their country is wrong. That's why we have the United Nations to sort these things out, and hopefully it'll work, not just NATO.
Strategic bombing, I think, could be a benefit, but
there's always too many civilian casualties.
Yeah, and I don't think Europe's got the resources themselves at the moment to do that.
And it hasn't resolved anything
anywhere
else, so why continue that way of dealing with problems?
No, I don't. The trouble with NATO is that the UN can't get together and send a peacekeeping force in, but NATO can go there and drop a few bombs on there just to aid one side or the other. I don't really think it's been demonstrated too well from either Afghanistan or Iraq that they do a particularly good job when they just drop bombs in places without really being 100% sure what's going on there.
I don't know, I'm sure there's some sort of peaceful solution, but I don't know what that is. Bombing's never going to help anything, so yeah. I'm all for peace.
I don't trust the Middle Eastern government in that region anyway. A lot of the time, especially when you see that they're claiming that the militants are causing atrocities, and then you hear the White House saying that there's no proof to back that up, and back and forth. So I think the government seems to be saying a lot of information that's just wrong, but I don't think either side will really tell the truth in situations like that, because there's bound to be a lot of crossfire and civilians caught in the middle either way.
You've just got to try and get as much information as you can through reading as much varied newspapers online as you can, and try and make an assessment based on your own reading.
I have to go to Syria and visit someone living there. You might get a straight answer.
Unless you're there, you don't really know what's going on, so just get what the media tells you. So
yeah, it's really hard to say from over here, because you're just pretty much stuck with whatever you see on the generic media.
My name's Brian Polar. I've been requested to chair this evening's monthly argument, which is, should there be military intervention in Syria? Each speaker will have about 4 or 5 minutes to outline a position.
My claim in relation to Syria is that we're at the point where regime change of some sort is necessary if Syria is to avoid going down further into the spiral of violence that it's already in. As I said in Crikey last week, when bloodshed on this scale is happening in a country, something is badly wrong with its government, and things need to change sooner rather than later. And I think that's the case even if you believe that the opposition in Syria is just as morally blameworthy or just as culpable in the present situation as the regime. I personally don't believe that, but even if you do, it doesn't change the situation that we're in a place where things are not going to get better unless there is a serious move to democratization. And I mention that because whenever I write about the subject, I get comments from people who say, "Look, you're just you're a tool of Western imperialism. You've been conned by the mass media. Dr. Assad is a perfectly nice chap, and everything would be fine if the West would just stop arming the terrorists." And the thing is, I agree with some of the premises of that argument. I don't believe you should believe everything that you read in the media. I don't believe you should believe everything the United States government tells you. But this is not Iraq, you know. This is not a situation where a country was stable until something intervened from outside. This is a movement across the region where people within individual countries have made the move themselves to demand democracy, to demand human rights, to demand participation in government. And whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the individuals involved, it seems clear that those movements are not going to go away if we in the West stop talking about them. So, question is, what do we do about it? What can be done? No surprise probably to you to hear that I think Russia is the key. Both because of its direct influence in Syria, as the regime's one major ally in the region, but also, of course, because Russia has veto power in the UN Security Council, and as a good internationalist, I believe that the maximum possible international consensus is necessary before you can justify intervening in this sort of situation. So I think it's in Russia's own interests to cooperate and to try to organize, try to usher in as quick and peaceful a transition in Syria as can possibly be arranged. It's not as if Russia has a personal stake in the current regime. It doesn't. What Russia wants is for its own geopolitical interests to be protected and for its own prestige not to be harmed. As it's no great power likes to be seen to be pulling the rug from under an ally. So Russian feelings need to be met in that regard. What can the West do? Firstly, Western countries should be working as much as possible with Russia, trying to allay Russian fears and trying to secure Russian cooperation. Secondly, we should also, and that extends to just ordinary people in Australia, we should be doing everything we can to raise awareness of the issue, try and convey to the world community that what's going on is unacceptable and change needs to happen. And failing everything, at some point the West may need to consider whether a sufficient consensus exists for intervention even without Russia.
It might be an appropriate time to introduce now Mr. Arthur Dent.
As soon as you start discussing Syria, you will find the arguments in favour of the Assad regime are exactly the same as the arguments in favour of the Egyptian regime. And the fears are the same. The fear is that in Egypt, the result inevitably will be that the Sunni majority, overwhelming majority in Egypt, will make it a far more Islamic country, a far less tolerant country in many respects. The Christians are feeling less secure in Egypt now than they were before. Well, and all of that has some real truth to it. But the simple fact is that it got that bad, it got that sectarian because of this autocratic regime saying we're the only way, we're the only people who can run a civilized government in a country like Egypt. It's just so backward that the fellow just are not capable of governing themselves. It has to be an elite like us has to run it. And that's the message we're getting from Assad. It's the message we're getting from the apologists and supporters of the regime. In Syria, there are real reasons for concern. The Saudis have been arming jihadi terrorists. There are jihadi terrorists in Syria now, and the Saudis are providing most of the military backing for the opposition. The longer that goes on, the more sectarian the conflict will be. The more the chance there will be that the Alawites and Christians and so on, other minorities in Syria will end up being really oppressed. If we don't want that to happen, then we need to intervene quickly. Now that is one point where I disagree strongly with Charles, is all this excuses about Russia. He says that the critical factor is whether Russia will support it or not. I think that's just fantasy from listening to Western propaganda, right? And that's another thing that I will agree with the people on the other side of the debate, that we get an awful lot of Western propaganda, right? But most of what we read about Syria and so on is totally slanted. Al Jazeera went absolutely overboard with the Egyptian revolution, and they managed to top themselves over Syria, right? But there's no question of impartial reporting and so on. They're clearly out to get rid of the regime. But part of the Western propaganda is, oh, the reason we're not intervening is because of Russia. And you only have to think about that for about 30 seconds for it to be just obviously silly. It's not as though Russia's got some military force that they would be threatening to intervene. China is also voting against it. It really doesn't make much difference. What matters is that whereas in Libya it was comparatively cheap and easy for the West to intervene, it's just a long coastal strip, and you could use NATO bombing to make a difference in the war, and even then it took more than 6 months before the regime collapsed. Syria has got a serious army, it's got serious, I'm not trying to make a pun, but Syria is not as tin-pot a regime as Libya. They've got an air defence system, they've got an army that can fight. An intervention will be a much more expensive and difficult activity, and the results will be that the countries that intervene will have to take some responsibility for it, and they'll be stuck with another costly thing. So they don't want to do it. But the longer they delay doing it, the worse the conflict will be. And I agree totally with what Charles said, that once you've got to a situation that they're in now, that government has to go. And I genuinely don't understand how anyone can, and I've spoken to people just today, saying they're confident that the Assad regime will survive. It just seems to me to be obvious that once the regime has to resort to tanks and helicopter gunships and even naval bombardment of their own cities, that regime cannot remain in power. And you can talk about this idyllic Syrian society and how it's not sectarian and so on. That's over. The regime has already engaged in an armed struggle against its own people. Such regimes cannot persist for long in this century.
I lived in Syria from 2004 to 2005, 2 years, and I taught English at the British Council for 2 years. So I met hundreds of Syrian people. Many of they were adults, and many of them worked for the government, many of them worked for private companies. We had a wonderful thing going in the classroom. I've been teaching English since 1975, you do the maths. And my experience of teaching in Damascus was probably the best 2 years of my life. There's a wonderful warmth among Syrian people, just wonderful. And people who go to Syria notice this. There's something magical about Syria. Some things that I observed were women's position. It's just extraordinary to me that women aren't mentioned in this debate about Syria. Before America invaded Afghanistan, women were often given as the reason. Women in Syria should be the reason for not invading, for not supporting Saudi Arabia's stand, for not supporting Qatar's stand. Women in Syria have the most freedom, I would say, of all Middle Eastern countries. Perhaps you could say Lebanon is similar, but you've got to remember Syria is a secular country. So when I would have students, women in my class, and the local women that I worked with, I often didn't know whether they were Sunni, whether they were Christian, whether they were whatever, what's left. And it was irrelevant because some Sunni women wore hijabs, some Sunni women didn't wear hijabs. It wasn't important, and I don't think anybody's really woken up to that unless you go to Syria and you see it. The Syrian people, there is no dialogue about your sect. They don't talk about the Sunni majority, the Alawi minority. They don't do that. They talk about Syrians. I am Syrian. Perhaps behind closed doors, there's another conversation going on. But they've been working so hard, and they believe the president is there supporting them, putting all that aside and doing what you would expect people to do, to live together as a community. And there's something beautiful about that. Some of my best friends are Sunni, some of my best friends are Alawi, some of them are Christian. And I'm proud of that, and I get information from all of them. What you find in the media, from the very beginning, and I think a good example of this is the gay girl from Damascus, I knew that that wasn't a Syrian person speaking, because Syrian people don't speak in such ugly ways about other sex. They just don't do that, unless they've got a problem, okay? Unless they've got a problem, and then they do, like Pauline Hanson sort of problem, okay? So something's happening to Syria, which is happening to the people, 22 million people, that is not welcome by the majority of people there. And it's being stirred up by the Western media, it's being stirred up by powers that want to destroy Syria for their own geopolitical reasons. And it's tragic that we are being sucked into it. There are some sacred cows that we are trusting. We're not looking to the 22 million Syrian people to tell us what's what. I watch Syrian satellite television. I see Syrian people on television. They have a huge impact on me because they are like you. Looking at Syrian people is like looking at a crowd of people like you. Some of them might have hijabs, some of them don't, but they are intelligent, highly sophisticated people. When I went to Syria, I thought I've got something to teach Syrians because I'm a Westerner, I'm well educated. That wasn't the case. I had a lot to learn from Syrians. Okay, I went there with a colonial view, and I came back humbled by what I had learned, because Syrians live in the Middle East. They know the Middle East. They know very well what's going on in the world. They have intense discussions about politics that we do not have here. It is just disgusting, the level of political debate here. It is so puerile, it is so simplistic. What they talk about there is very deep. They have their children and their grandchildren to think about. All we have to think about is whether we're right or not, whether we're right or wrong, and then we get on with life.
I lived in Syria for 36 years. Additionally, I served in the Syrian army for 3 years. So when I describe what's happening in Syria, I'm talking from experience. After gaining my PhD, I went back to Syria and I did work for the largest research institute in Damascus for 4 years. Thinking about what's happening now in Syria, I put it in a simple way that it is a call for freedom. It is not what has been described as conflict between Sunni and Shi'i or Sunni and Alawi. And in fact, what happened in recent days is developed by the regime itself. The regime has been pushing people to use arms to create this conflict among different ethnic groups. So if we are open-minded and if we watch exactly what's happening, nothing wrong with people when they call for freedom, for equity. I anticipated at the start that because Bashar al-Assad has his doctorate degree, he will be wise enough to step down and save the country and save his people. To the contrary, he appeared to be, and he proved to be, a murderer similar to his dad. Because we all remember what his dad did back in 1982 in Hama, when it was reported 30,000 to 40,000 people were killed. But at that time, the media was not that developed. People could not pass the message outside. What he missed out these days, that no matter what he does, he cannot stop people from passing the message outside. So I do agree with the previous speakers, Arthur and Charles, that a change is needed. And no matter how, the regime has to go in order to save the country. He already caused a lot of damage in terms of killing, in terms of destroying the infrastructure. Millions or billions of dollars are needed to rebuild Syria. That can be done, but those who have been killed, there is no way to bring them back. But no matter what, I believe the solution to this issue is to stop this regime, and this regime must go.
The group that I'm a member of actually actively fought the Syrian regime for 15 years in its occupation of Lebanon. Then made peace with Syria as a whole once Syria left Lebanon. In my perspective, see, I've never done a debate before since school, so I wrote this whole thing, but I'm not going to tell you about this. I want to tell you about the real life situation on the ground. I want to tell you about some true stories. Because living in our comfort in the West, we get to look at everything from a textbook sort of scenario about political experimentation and geopolitical strategy and whatever else. The reality on the ground is much harsher than that. It's a lot harsher than that. And unfortunately, a couple of the speakers today brought back to mind an interview I saw, and I'll never forget, with the former US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who described the Israeli attack on Lebanon that was backed by the West. And it was actually, you know, governments refused to call for a ceasefire, thinking that we'll give Israel time to get rid of Hezbollah. As they were doing that, 1,300 Lebanese died. 900 of them were children. Businesses were destroyed. The country, you know, and the country is no different to here. Very progressive, very modern, very open society. And as that country was being bombed and its people were being killed, commentators today reminded me of the statement of Condoleezza Rice where she compared it to the birth of a child. Did anyone remember that? She talked about the birth pangs of a new Middle East. You know, you watch Channel 9, you listen to these commentators, they have no idea what's going on over there. They've got no idea what's going on in Syria. And it's such a shame that in our society, how easily media can be co-opted into geopolitical strategy. So there's a big conflict going on between the US and Iran. And they see Syria's government as a big supporter of Iran. We've got to get rid of it. So in doing so, we support with the most tyrannical regimes on earth, Saudi Arabia, no embarrassment to say that, the arming of some of the most awful fundamentalists that you can imagine, who will help truck in and bring into Syria and smuggle them over the border from Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and Iraq, whilst we play our geopolitical game. This geopolitical game, I'll give you an example of it. 3 weeks ago I went to visit a friend and pay commiserations. His brother had been murdered in Homs. His brother was from a district in Homs known as Hamadigi. And there is not a single opposition member that can deny this. 138,000 Christians have been ethnically cleansed by Homs, from Homs, by the same people that some here are suggesting today we should militarily intervene to support. The media is a powerful, powerful tool. It convinced us that the Mujahideen in Afghanistan back in the 80s was some good group of nice people trying to get rid of this awful regime that's got to go. It's backed up by the Soviet Union. And I watched a YouTube video that some of you have probably seen of Hillary Clinton in a university telling the students that the problem with the conflict in Afghanistan is that the United States is fighting the very people that we armed and we supported back in the 80s when we brought them in to get rid of this regime that had to go in our geopolitical struggle with the Soviet Union. And we armed it. And we used our media machine to turn it into this amazing, you know, remember they used to picture them on horses, Lawrence of Arabia-esque. These same people are now carrying out systematic murder across Syria. They've ethnically cleansed, as I said, the entire Christian population of Homs, who are now refugees. And how many relatives I have with their relatives on the phone begging them for visas to come to Australia. Let's be honest about Syria. I think every single person here today can agree on something, and that is that there needs to be change in Syria. So there are two issues here that we need to talk about. One is genuine need for a reform in Syria. Two is confusing it with a geopolitical struggle with the main players being the United States and Iran.
I just wanted to say, look, we seem to have, we obviously have two very different views about what's happening in Syria, you know, about who's responsible for massacring whom, etc. Okay, now, I have an opinion about who's right on that, but it's basically uninformed, so it's not my place to say that. My question is, to Robert and I suppose also to Susan, assume you're right about that. Assume that the opposition is actually more culpable in violence than the regime. What should we do about it? Do you still think the regime can survive? Wouldn't, even if the opposition is in the wrong, wouldn't it still be better to have democracy so that those things can be sorted out by the people themselves?
I think it's important for Syria to survive, not for the regime.
Arthur? Okay, I asked before about the Iranian geopolitical explanation, and I got a really honest answer. He said nothing about Iran. He did not try to pretend that this was a US plot to destabilise Syria because of Iran, which was just to me pure fantasy. Instead, he said openly and clearly, yes, this is part of the Arab Spring, but it should be called an Arab Winter because it's a disaster and it will result in the Salafi rule and so on. And to me, that's an honest, that is the real situation. But the fact is, these are backward countries where the majority of the population do support the bizarre religion. In Australia, we're pretty fortunate. Although half the population does claim to be Christian, they don't actually go to church, right? Most Australians don't actually believe this shit. Right? But in the Middle East, most people do believe some kind of superstitious gibberish. And they're going to govern, right? Now, it's been admitted, and I want to give Robert the chance to withdraw it and to actually try to pretend that he agrees with what the Assad regime is claiming, namely that it is a Western Saudi plot to destabilise Syria on behalf of their struggle with Iran, instead of what you just admitted, that it's part of the Arab Spring, which all the autocracies really are opposed to. Or is it
Please don't label these countries as backward countries. They're real people, real lives. There are more gay bars in Beirut than there are in Melbourne. What are your measures for countries being forward or backward? I don't know. Number two, the Arab Spring, to me, I can only base it on the results. And the results that I see on the ground are intervention from outside to make sure that the results that occur afterwards aren't natural in any form. They're not what the people went out into Tahrir Square to get. Okay. And in Tunisia, certainly not what the people had in mind when you know, the bravest Arab of all time set himself on fire on the first day of all of this. So it's not an Arab Spring. Yes, it has been hijacked. And when I talk about the struggle between Iran and the United States, Iran is a rejectionist state. It's not accepting the presence of Israel. Over 80 million, its economy is growing, it's developing technologically, it's developing weapons that can counter maybe in the future the weapons of the States. It has a 35-year relationship with the government of Syria, and any attempts, political attempts over the last 20 years by Arab states or the US or anyone else, using any means to try to pry that relationship open, like to break that relationship, have failed. And they see that as an extension of the Iranian reach into Lebanon and the presence of Hezbollah and Hamas in Israel. So yes, the removal of the Syrian regime isolates Iran, and then it isolates Hezbollah in Lebanon, and it's already removed Hamas from that grouping. So very much the strategy. And you don't go by what I'm saying. I'm not a scientist, political scientist commenting on TV. Just read WikiLeaks. Read the briefs that the Americans had with the Arabs in the various embassies of the United States over the last few years, and you'll understand that yes, the big geopolitical and geostrategic aim of the United States is the removal of Iran's reach by cutting off, and this is their terminology, its tentacles.
From what I've heard tonight, there's might be other issues which I'm just not aware of. I feel that the regime is in the fault. They're at fault because they just refuse to back down when it seems like the people are not happy with them.
I think it's mainly political. I think a lot of the trouble in Syria is instigated by external elements, obviously wanting to destabilize Syria for whatever reason. But I think I don't think it's a homegrown conflict. Syrians have lived happily for a long, long time without any problems. If you look at Lebanon as well, their neighbor, they've had problems with sectarian violence as well, but it hasn't never come to Syria before. So it's a very different situation there, I think.
Andrew, I wonder if you mind telling us what you know about Syria and think about what's happening in Syria.
Well, to be honest, I really don't know much. I don't watch TV. I've been homeless for the last 15 years, so TV is not a high priority in my life. But I have heard there's shit going down there, and I would like to know more about it because I like to be informed about these things. But at the moment, because I don't have a TV and I don't have a place, it's kind of hard to stay on top of what's going on in the world, you know. I don't have a TV at all. Yeah, I know the TV's bullshit. That's half the reason I don't watch it. That's half the reason I don't want one.
Andrew, when you say you know there's shit happening in Syria, what sort of shit?
Well, I know there's bad shit happening to the people that live there. I don't know exactly why and what it is for. I know the government's involved somehow, but that's about it. I really don't know much. I've my sister's living in Dubai at the moment, so she told me a little bit about it because it's sort of that area, but because she actually went through there and she told me about it and how sort of scary it was, and so. But other than that, I really don't know much. I wish I could say more, but I don't know much.
The story in the newspaper, as most people read it, is that the government is cracking down in a very brutal fashion against peaceful protesters. So it's a very simple narrative.
That's bullshit. Why? Man, people have the right to free speech, don't we? Isn't a protest free speech?
But what if I were to say to you that a lot of those people in the streets with the protesters, some of the protesters, of course, are genuine and peaceful, and they've got a reason to ask for reform. But what if the bad element have guns and are killing policemen, assassinating?
Hey, look, there's not much you can do about that unless you get guns yourself and shoot back. But then that only makes the problem worse, okay? So, I don't know how it can be done, but it has to be done peacefully, hopefully through talking. And I think everything can be solved through talking, no matter what it is, you know? I lived on the streets, I've been pissed on, I've been bashed up, I've been fucking everything in the streets, and it wasn't fun. But I'm still here, and I'm still fucking kicking. And look, I don't know much about the world because I've been so isolated from it. I would like to know more, and I would like to get more involved because a couple of my friends are very passionate about this sort of stuff, and I actually live in a commission flat at the moment. I just got housing about 6 months ago, and I see all the refugees coming into the commission housing, and man, they are there for legit reasons. They're not there to fucking sell drugs or be violent or be dickheads. They're there to try and make a new life, man, and that is cool. Yeah.
The main reason we're here is because we're calling on Mr. Rudd to allow the Syrian ambassador to come to Australia so we can have those talks.
Bring it, I reckon. Let him in, mate. Like, why wouldn't they? If he's an ambassador for a country, we need to talk. That's part of fucking diplomatic bullshit, isn't it? Like, we do need to talk and we need to fucking sort this shit out. It's just going to be hell otherwise, you know, because it's going to be every man for himself, and then we're going to fucking... People who've stashed guns and shit and bunkers in their fucking property, they're going to be the ones on top, and... It's going to be hell, mate.